Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to respond to a user request, or a viewer request rather, for a roadmap review that I was presented with, and this time we're going to look at the backend roadmap for 2018. So let's get started. So this roadmap here seems to be indicating that the first thing that you need to learn in order to be an effective web developer for working on the primarily on the back end, that the most ideal solutions is Ruby, Python, Node.js, PHP 7, and we have a group of C Sharp, Java, and Go here as well. Now these are basically optionals that you can pick one of these, and I'll just talk about this just touch on this very quickly. So first and foremost, I can say that PHP is by far, if we are talking pure web development, we're talking about just web development, and if you're primarily interested in making web pages, then PHP 7 is by hands down the best first choice for you. If it runs more or less I think it's a third or something like that of all the web pages on the internet. So PHP is like all you can just ignore. Like Python and Ruby don't even come close to PHP when it comes to web development. And I would even say that I think Python and Ruby they're out there, but I don't see this is me I'm very opinionated here, but I don't really see Ruby and Python have the same type of usage adoption as PHP and Node.js these days, at least. It might have been the case a little while ago. Like Ruby was really big, especially Ruby on Rails, where it was really big a little while back, but today I don't really hear many people talk about Ruby or Python for web development purposes. Python is probably is is popular these days mostly because of how amazing it is at machine learning and computer science. But for web development, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying that from my perspective, Node.js and PHP are probably the stronger choices. So let's just quickly touch on them. Let's say that you wanted to let's just compare Node.js and PHP in terms of like pros and cons very quickly. So PHP 7 for pure web development, I think that this is probably it's a really strong good first choice. It's going to teach you a lot, and it's going to be very useful. It's also very popular in terms of when it comes to jobs and so forth. There are a few of them out there. However, depending on your region, this is unfortunately the case. PHP is very popular in some areas of the world, and Node.js is probably the biggest poster child still for innovation and technology. So Node.js is honestly, it's kind of unfair. PHP has a massive amount of usage across the web, but in terms of popularity, just in the workplaces, I would say that Node.js is a better choice. I would even go as far as to say if you're doing modern web development today, Node.js, regardless of if you work full time on the server or not, you're gonna have to kind of learn it. If you do front end development, for example, almost all the tools that you use in order to structure like a React application, an Angular application, or anything like that uses this piece of technology. So me personally, I would go with Node.js as my first choice if I had to choose between these languages here. And we will talk about these in just a moment. Just don't think I forgot about the other languages. But for pure web development, if you just want to do just web pages basically, PHP is probably the stronger choice. But otherwise, for professional work, I would say that Node.js is probably going to serve you better. That's at least the way I think about it. So let's walk through Node.js testing. For testing for Node.js, I would say that this is a little bit outdated. I would say that if you're learning a test framework for Node.js, stick with Jest. It's my personal favorite, and it basically does all the things that Mocha does without needing to like import. I mean, if you wanted to do Mocha development, you kind of have to have Shy in there. So I don't know why these things are separated, because Mocha is really just running your test for you, but while Jest gives you the runner and a bunch of other tools that will allow you to be very productive. These others I would skip altogether unless you are going to do React development. Then you should look into Enzyme. That's very good. So let's look at frameworks. I 100% agree with this. Express is, if you're going to learn to do server-side Node.js, Express should be your first stop. It is by far the most popular of all of these, with Happy probably coming in as a pretty good second. I've used that one as well. And the others, they are out there, but none of them are going to beat Express. That's not, at least from my perspective, Express is pretty much a standard. That's at least my take on matters. Package managers, I would say that these two are, yeah, npm and yarn are the two that are available, and I would stick with npm because npm is the standard. And if you start working on a project where they use yarn, you can learn yarn in like a few minutes, of an hour or an afternoon or something like that. They're so similar that it's really not, it doesn't really make much of a difference. If you like yarn more than npm, then please, use yarn. I personally use npm. Let's look at PHP. So for package manager, yes, Composer is really, really useful. It is like you it's the I don't there might be others, but Composer is the one I used for package management when it comes to PHP. And for testing, PHP unit, yes, that is the one that we were using PHP at my previous job at Ticketmaster, and we were using PHP unit. I don't know much about these other tools here, but I don't see any reason why we wouldn't use these. I haven't looked into these two. These are new to me. But PHP unit at least, yes, that's a very good bet. When it comes to frameworks, Laravel is, yes, I would say that this is a very nice framework. If you are not making your own custom, it's kind of like Node.js. Like, you can absolutely write a complete, like, web framework yourself. You can do it all custom. You don't have to use Express for Node.js, but I would say Express helps a lot when it comes to doing server-side Node.js. And I feel the same way about Laravel. And yeah, these two I haven't worked with, but Symfony and Laravel, they kind of come together. Symfony is a subpart which basically handles a small portion of what Laravel is doing. So think of Symfony as this. I'm not going to go too far into Symfony, but one of the main features of Symfony is being able to do effective routing and stuff of that nature. So Symfony is very useful to know about as well. This abbreviation I'm not so familiar with, but I think it's like conduct rules or something like that, or something. No, I'm not going to touch on it because I don't actually know what this is. This I do know, however. Xdebug is very nice. I personally used it when I was debugging and profiling my PHP code. These other tools I'm not that familiar with. I wouldn't say that this is all that a hard. Like, this is not a hard requirement by any means. This might be, Xdebug is like fairly professional level stuff for the most part when you're doing basic as a beginner. When you're doing PHP development, the way that you debug things is that you're going to refresh your browser and see the output to the screen. That's at least, or do a var dump or something like that. So I this I can recommend to have a look at if you want to take your debugging of PHP code to the next level. Anywho, here we have C#, Java, and Go. Now I would completely say that that Go is even remote to even put Go on the same list as Java and C#. I think it's almost an insult, because although Go is very popular these days in terms of hype, there's a lot of companies talking about Go, but Java and C# are roughly I would say arguably the most popular languages in terms of adoption in the world. They are so massive, probably with the exception of maybe C++. C# and Java like Java runs over 1 billion devices, or I think it's 9 billion devices or something like that. It's a ludicrous amount of products that use Java, and the same thing goes for C#. I would even go as far as to say, if your goal is to get a job as quickly as humanly possible, to become a professional developer in the shortest amount of time, learn C# or Java. You can ignore all of this other bullshit, because I love Node.js and I think PHP is awesome. And I mean, all of these, even Ruby and Python, I've been working in, but nothing even comes close in terms of popularity and job opportunity as C# and Java. Go isn't even, in my opinion, on the map in comparison to these two languages. Go is probably one of my favorite languages, but I'm going to be honest and say that if I had to pick one of these languages, my selection would be if I didn't know anything else and my goal was I want to be a professional developer, I want to work in this industry, I would choose either C# or Java, one of these two to start off with. I actually did start with Java, if you're interested. That's where I came from, but C# is something that I worked with fairly soon thereafter, and I can tell you that these two are very interchangeable. Pick one and just trust me, you're gonna get a job, hands down. Promise you, like Scout's honor. Anywho, let's move on. So here we have a node that states that it's good for you to know a web server. I think this is kind of weird because, alright, as a beginner, okay, what's a web server? Well, it kind of depends on what you're going to do, right? So a web server such as Nginx, Apache, and Caddy, well, yeah, these are useful, but let's say, take Apache for example. If you're learning PHP, you kind of have to learn Apache. It's not the only option out there, but you can't really run PHP without Apache in an effective manner. Kind of need that. And Nginx, yeah, sure, you can learn Nginx, but what would be the reason to learn a web server if you don't even know what selection you have made here? I would say that this is a little bit. I'm not going to say too much because I don't really know what the intention with this thing here is, but yeah, sure, web servers are useful. RESTful APIs. This is a little bit fancier. This is higher level stuff where we talk about API design versus, I would say that even if it's not RESTful, I would say that learning the difference between an API, like a web API, or let's call it a RESTful API, and just traditional web pages is useful for a beginner because those are the two main architectures for how we build software on web applications today. So traditionally what you would do, say in the PHP days, you would have a web page that rendered on the server and was sent to the browser. But nowadays when you have things such as in Node.js land, it's much more popular to send a single HTML file and then have something like React or Angular or something of that nature run a JavaScript application in the browser and then simply communicate with the server through a RESTful API. So I would say that learning these APIs and the difference between them and web pages are very useful. Authentication, I 100% agree with authentication. You need to know how to authenticate a user. I would say that these two are very subjective. I would say that instead of learning JSON Web Tokens or OAuth 2, ignore these to start off with and learn how to use sessions. Sessions are more widespread and more common than JSON Web Tokens and OAuth, but you should look at these two when you feel that you need to. Some companies use them, but they are very progressive, I would say. I haven't really talked to anybody I personally love JSON Web Tokens, but I also am aware of that they are not that widespread, not in comparison to sessions. Solid, Kiss, yeah, these are the different programming principles. Basically, I absolutely agree. I would say that you need to learn MVC, like the most important architectures of writing code are Solid, Kiss, loose coupling is my favorite one, and then you have OOP or object-oriented programming, stuff of that nature. So learning the different practices, I absolutely agree that this is fairly useful. Regular expressions, I agree. Regular expressions are very powerful and very important. I think that GraphQL, you can completely ignore this. GraphQL is it's one of the most exciting pieces of technologies that I've worked with, but I can also tell you that this is a piece of technology that is covered in so much hype that people start using it without even realizing that they don't need it. I see people who throw GraphQL at a single server and they put that extra complexity in there. In my opinion, GraphQL is a perfect solution if you have a lot of different data sources and you need some way of aggregating all those different data sources into a single endpoint or a single server, or basically aggregating a lot of widespread data sources. That's where I would say GraphQL is useful. For a beginner who's just building a monolithic application of some sort, or just trying to build a simple web page, shit, ignore this. This is like, even by industry, even in the professional world, most people don't use GraphQL. It's a very popular and hyped technology, but it's not an industry standard or something that is all that used, not from my perspective. Then we have Docker. So Docker is probably one of the most trendiest words in the world right now, in the world of IT. And I think that Docker is, I would say, do it like this. Learn how to just build a web. Let's say that you do Node.js. Start by simply getting a web page up and working. And when you know how to get it up and working, and you just know how to develop things, look into Docker as as the next thing. Learn proper application development first, and then look into Docker, because Docker is powerful and Docker is very useful. But Docker also puts more. It's if you know when to use Docker, it's the best thing in the world. But for a beginner who may not understand exactly how to use Docker, it's not the good thing to start looking into immediately. It's just going to confuse you. When you need, I would say your rule of thumb, the rule of thumb for Docker is when you realize that you have a distributed system. In other words, you have several different applications that you need to run on one computer, or you need to run them in parallel, or you need them to talk to each other or something like that, then that's when Docker becomes relevant. But if you're just running a single server on your own machine or some remote box, then no, Docker isn't all that useful, at least not in the beginning. I think that when you have a little bit of, if you have worked, let's say that after your first year of professional development, or at least when you've spent a year learning all of this other stuff, then Docker becomes relevant. If you don't agree, that's fine. Learn Docker, because I'm not saying that it's not useful. I think it's extremely useful. I'm very, very happy with Docker. But for a beginner, I think it's a little bit too early if you haven't learned all of this other stuff. Message brokers. This is highly subjective. I would say that I've worked in a few company or in a few places where we actually use message brokers with queuing systems and stuff of that nature. This is not a very holistic list either, but I would say ignore this completely. The only time you need to know about RabbitMQ and Apache Kafka is if you work in a company where they actually need a queue system. You can spend a little time and just know what it is, but don't like go and become some expert of a RabbitMQ, because odds are, as a beginner, you're going to spend you're not going to use this stuff. This is for much larger systems than, say, your personal web page or something like that. For There are some companies I've worked with that use them, but there are also plenty of companies that are not using this type of technology. So learn it when you need to. Then let's look at caching or storage. Caching, Memcached and Redis. This is a very good list. I would say if you have to pick between Memcached and Redis, look at Redis. Redis is probably the most popular caching solution that I see today. Memcached is a little bit more established, but I think Redis is, well, I wouldn't say more established, but Redis is probably the sexier option of these two. That's this is me being very opinionated, but I think that Redis is a better bet than Memcached at this point. I mean, I've used Memcached previously as well at companies who are a little bit older and didn't really get on the Redis train with everybody else, but Redis is that's my personal favorite. Relational databases, Postgres, MariaDB, MySQL, MSS. Yeah, okay, so this is a good list. I would say that these things here are this is a little bit too much. I would say if you are just starting out, start with MySQL. It's probably the most established and widespread of all of these. Postgres coming in after that, I would say. Postgres is probably the most modern flavor of a relational database. And honestly, if you don't want to be too retro and go all the way back to MySQL, I started out with MySQL, and most programmers I think start with MySQL. Then go into Postgres. Like Postgres is it's really good as well. I would say pick one, Postgres or MySQL. If you want to be modern, use Postgres. If you want to be retro like myself, do MySQL as the first stop, because it's fairly, especially if you're doing like something like PHP development, like almost all of the tutorials are oriented around MySQL because they've been together for so long. And well, yeah, I'm not going to say too much about that. I see equal amounts of people using MySQL as Postgres, and Oracle and MS SQL is really if you do Java development and C# and so forth. MariaDB, I haven't worked much with that, but as far as I know, I think it's the next iteration of MySQL. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it's that the author of MySQL is actually involved in MariaDB, if he's not the author. Let's have a look at NoSQL databases as well. So Redis and MongoDB. I think that this is really good. Ignore these down here. These are not all that relevant for a beginner. Redis, as we saw earlier, is really good for caching strategies, and MongoDB is a document database. And I think that on average, document databases and relational databases are probably the most common databases that you're going to work with. And I would say do something like this. Start by building a project using something like a relational database, and just feel it out. Just build something and see how that feels, and then try to build something else with a document database, just so you get the sensation for what the differences is. You never don't combine them in the same project or something like that. Pick one and see how you like it, and then build something else and use the other one just to see the differences, because it's a very good learning experience. I would say that in terms of industry standards, relational databases are more common than MongoDB, but MongoDB has a few, or document databases have a few strengths that I think are very valuable to know about. And finally, let's look at the last node here. So search engines. This is highly subjective. I would say you can Solar and Sphinx, you don't have to think about them all that much. These are tools that you learn if your job specification or like at your company people want you to learn it. It's not something that you need to know in order to get a job most of the time, because I'll not dive into that all that much. Elasticsearch is a really nice and very cool database, but I would say that the rule of thumb for Elasticsearch is only go in and learn Elasticsearch if you are building something that requires search support. If you are building a search engine or something like that, or you have a system where people discover other people or products or whatever through searching in a search box, something like what Google does. If that's what your goal is, then Elasticsearch should be the first thing on your list. This database is perfect for that, because searching is one of the hardest damn things in programming. I would say that there are three things that you should be very careful with doing yourself and probably not do at all, and that is to try to implement your own time library, or try to implement your own cryptography library, or try to implement your own search algorithm. Elasticsearch will give you the best support for searching, hands down. I really enjoy it. So here we have some design patterns, architectural patterns. These are too vague for me to be able to comment on, and give DDD a shot. I think this is hilarious. DDD stands for Domain Driven Development. And I can tell you right now, if you want to be an object-oriented programmer, so let's say that you started doing C# or Java, domain-driven development is like peanut butter and jelly. You are going to learn this one way or another if you start working in an object-oriented fashion. So I would say that you can't really learn these types of languages and do like object-oriented programming without understanding what domain-driven development is. So yes, this is very important. And then finally, learn different testing techniques. Well, that's also useful, but it's a little bit vague for me to comment on it. Anywho, I hope that this little review of mine has given you something, and I hope that you have a great day, basically. Have a great day.